All right, welcome. This is our first of three snippets, and for the first asynchronous version of the class. And remember, this is basically what we'll be doing every week throughout the semester. The snippets are designed to be individual units, so as long as you listen to them in order, you don't have to listen to them all at once. This is a kind of super introductory session, so I'll be covering basically 170 years in the three snippets, and the goal here is just to kind of get a gist of what's going on until we get up to the 20th century. So the first of the snippets is going to look at the 18th and early 19th century, where first the American colonies and then the independent United States are very, very much marginal in the international system that existed at the time. So this is it's a map of Europe in the 1720s. The way to think of this international system was that it was very much dominated by Europe. The strongest countries in the world were, at this point, were all in Europe. The Europeans had extended throughout the Western Hemisphere, had acquired colonies, had begun to move into coastal portions of Africa, some colonization in Asia, especially in South Asia as well. And this was a system that was dominated by Great Britain and France. And the period between 1689 and 1815 is basically a period of constant warfare between Britain and allies and France and allies, and these allies often would change between various wars, and with interspersed with very brief periods of peace. And in some ways, the American Revolutionary War is simply another one of these British-French wars. It's war fought by the colonists, obviously, but with strong support from the French. So this is the dominant part of the world in terms of international relations in the 18th century. This is not. So here's a map of the settled areas in terms of colonization in the sort of at the dawn of the 18th century. And I like this map because it gives a sense of, well, it's true that the European countries claimed to have colonized virtually all of North America by at least the middle part of the 18th century. In fact, significant parts of the hemisphere remained under the control of Native American nations, and throughout the 18th century, Native American nations were functioning as part of an international system, and the British and the French would both make treaties with Native American nations. The Native American government sort of moved between the two sides and in various wars, so it's a quite complex system. For our purposes, the critical aspect of this is that these British American colonies, which technically under a system called mercantilism, which basically says that colonies exist solely for the benefit of the colonizing country. They don't have any independent economic policy. They don't have any independent foreign policy. That was technically how the British ruled them. But in fact, Britain, beginning in the mid 1600s, largely ignored these colonies. I mean, the British, it's a very tumultuous period in terms of British politics. The British are interested in colonizing into India during this period. Some very lucrative colonies in the Caribbean, slave colonies, especially in Jamaica. And so the British approach to these colonies is basically, you do what you want as long as you're not costing us any money, and by and large they did not. And so in a really odd sort of situation, and one that the international relations theorists of the 18th century, this wasn't supposed to happen in terms of how they organized the world. As the 18th century progressed, these British American colonies, as population was growing, started getting a sense that they had an independent sort of strategic interest. There was trade between the British American colonies and the Spanish American colonies. Again, according to the principles of mercantilism, you don't have intercolonial trade. But also, and I think most critically, these consistent wars between the British and the French. And here's a sort of tighter map shot on North America. The British are in control of the areas here in red. The French are in control of the area here in blue. And then there's disputed area between the two sides. These wars increasingly pulled the British American colonies into the international system, but also convinced the British American colonists, at least the elite of the British American colonists, that they were not being well served remaining under the control of Britain. And the key sort of development here was the fate of this French port called Louisbourg, which is in what the northern part of what is now Nova Scotia, which remained under French control throughout the middle part of the 18th century. And this is a picture of Louisbourg. It was a fairly sophisticated naval base, or what passed for a fairly sophisticated naval base in the 18th century. And the French used this naval base to launch raids on New England and to a lesser extent New York. And so when war resumed between Britain and France in the 1740s, wonderfully named conflict called the War of Jenkins' Ear, it was militias from colonial militias from New England that organized a campaign to drive the French out of Louisbourg, and they succeeded. This was seen as a great victory by the colonists. War ends 1748. As occurred in all of these 18th century wars, the British and the French get together. They negotiate a global peace deal, and basically, and this is a war where the British did better than the French, but they didn't completely win the war either. Basically, the British care more about India than they do about Nova Scotia. After all, there aren't raids from Louisbourg into London or anything like that. The French want to retain Louisbourg because they see it as critical to keeping their colony in Canada. And so as a result, a trade is worked out whereby the French give the British French concessions in India, and in exchange, the British return Louisbourg to the French, and this is met with outrage in the colonies. And so when the next war begins, a war called the French and Indian War in the colonies, a war called the 7 Years' War between Britain and France. The war was 7 years in Europe, but it was actually 9 years in the colonies. It started in 1754. Colonial leaders get together and say we simply cannot trust the British, and they increasingly embrace the idea of some kind of informal unification. Benjamin Franklin is here. He's the kind of theoretical pioneer in this, and he comes up with a plan called the Albany Plan, which is designed to allow the individual colonies to form a kind of confederation and alliance. And again, this is not supposed to happen in the colonial world. The conflict ends before the Albany Plan really gets together, but it's a reminder of how these 18th century wars, this international system, led the colonists to think of themselves kind of as an independent nation with independent strategic interests. In any case, we get the War of the American Revolution, which is an international conflict. The colonists win in large part because the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch all provide them with significant both military and economic support. And then they repay the colonists, chiefly Franklin, who was the chief U.S. negotiator, repay the British, repay the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish by double crossing them at the peace deal, and concluding a separate peace with the British, and the British are willing to go along with this because they want to break up the alliance. And as a result, this newly independent country, the United States, gets this huge swath of territory here in not just the Atlantic coast, but what's now significant portions of the Middle West and the South. The French agree that they will sort of cede their territory, and so the remaining territory becomes Spanish. and the British retain Canada. So an independent United States. This new government has to set up this new nation has to set up a system of government. Does so through the Constitution. This is not a course in constitutional history. I teach one. If you like this course, you can take the constitutional history course later on. But there are a couple of sections of the Constitution that are very relevant for us and are going to keep popping up over and over again in this course. The first is that the framers think a lot about foreign affairs and how the government will interact with foreign affairs, and they make a very conscious decision that the dominant branch in foreign affairs will be Congress, will not be the president. The framers were obsessed with this idea of excessive executive power, leading to tyranny. So this is these items that you see here on the screen are all from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. This is the section that lays out congressional power, and just read through these powers. Essentially, everything here is given to Congress. Congress has the power to tax and raise money. Congress has the power to declare war, to maintain the military, to call forth the militia, which was much more important in the 18th century than today. It's not the equivalent of the National Guard. Presidential powers in the Constitution were extremely minimal by contrast. President is made the commander in chief, but the understanding at the time was essentially that the president was basically just the chief military officer. That is, the president could give orders to generals. So this didn't give the president a kind of independent power in foreign affairs. And the president was given the power to make treaties and nominate ambassadors, but both of these things required the consent of 2/3 of the Senate. So the framers envision a system of government in which the U.S. is going to be an active participant, although it's a weak country at this point, in international affairs, but the dominant branch is going to be Congress. That doesn't play out basically at all in the Washington administration. The first major U.S. treaty is negotiated. It's a thing called the Jay's Treaty. This is John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, steps down to become a U.S. sort of diplomat negotiating this treaty with the British. This is a very controversial treaty because it's seen as benefiting the interests of the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states, which want a close commercial relationship with the British, at the expense of the South, which was more pro-French. It narrowly gets through the Senate, basically on a regional vote. This is kind of a pre-party period in American history, and then the House, where the South was more powerful at this point, tries to block it and fails, and that does set a precedent that the House is not going to involve itself in the making of treaties. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson is elected. He campaigns on this idea that he'll be a strict constructionist, that he'll follow the letter of the law of the Constitution. That never happens with presidents, and it certainly doesn't happen with Jefferson. Jefferson is the proponent of what he calls an empire for liberty. And think about that phrase for a minute. It's an inherently contradictory phrase. But the vision for Jefferson is Jefferson envisions the United States as being a country of yeoman farmers, of course, white yeoman farmers. Jefferson owns slaves, that because he argues that in a capitalist system where people are working for someone else, that means they'll vote their economic interests, they'll vote the interests of their boss, of their employer, of their business, and so what we need is a system of small farms, and so people will elect virtuous leaders, but the only way to do that is to constantly expand. And so Jefferson agrees, although the constitutionality of this is is suspect, to purchase this huge swath of land from the French, which need money for, this is Napoleon at this point in France. They need money for fighting the war with Britain. And Jefferson also, despite his promise of strict construction, wages an undeclared naval war with the Barbary states, these pirate countries on the northern coast of Africa, which for the first time bring the United States into the Middle East. And so the critical thing here is that Jefferson says he's going to respect congressional power in foreign affairs, but in fact does not. And this is a recurrent pattern we're going to encounter it time and time again in this course. One final aspect of this early period of American diplomacy. Jefferson serves 2 terms. He's replaced by James Madison, who serves 2 terms, who's replaced by James Monroe, whose Secretary of State is this man, John Quincy Adams, who will replace Monroe as president, albeit only for 1 term in 1824. And Adams, who is an extraordinarily capable Secretary of State, is running for president in 1824. It's one of the wildest elections in U.S. history. It's an almost unprecedented contest in that it was a legitimate 4-way race. The party system basically entirely breaks down, and Adams's strength is in the Northeast, the more pro-British sections. But he wants to campaign as a more national figure. He's worried about being attacked. Ultimately, he got elected when the race is thrown to the House. But this backdrop, the Adams's political need not to be seen as pro-British, plays a role in the adoption of this document that is known as the Monroe Doctrine, although the key person here was Adams, in which the revolt of Spanish colonies in South America is met with a statement by the United States that it is declining a British offer for a joint statement that neither Britain nor the United States will accept Spanish restoration of rule in South America, and instead unilaterally making a statement that the United States will not tolerate European political rule. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is a dead letter. The U.S. doesn't enforce it for decades after its issuance, but it does show a pattern of an intersection between domestic politics and foreign affairs, which is one of the major themes of this class. And that is it for the first of the 3 snippets.